So, let's return to the Scotland hate crime bill now, and this time we're going to speak to someone who's a little more critical of the new legislation. Michael Foran is a lecturer in public law at the University of Glasgow, and he joins me now. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Andrew.
Now, I wanted to come to you about this hate crime law and specifically what your reservations about it might be. Could you maybe give us a brief outline?
I think that the main issue with the law as it stands is I think a failure of the Scottish Government to recognise the context into which this law is being introduced. So there's an ongoing political debate about the interaction between trans rights and women's rights. We're all aware of this. And ordinarily you would imagine the introduction of a new offence of stirring up hatred on the basis of certain characteristics would take into account the fact that there is an ongoing political debate that will involve people exercising their human rights to freedom of expression, and that specific carve-outs would be put onto the face of the bill to make it clear to everybody involved that the expression of legitimate political speech in this context wouldn't be criminal. That's certainly what was recommended by the Law Commission for England and Wales when it considered the expansion of hate crime laws in England. And it's also what they did when they expanded hate crime laws into the context of religion and sexual orientation. They carved out specific instances to say, well, look, if you're criticising a religion or ridiculing a religion, that won't count as a hate crime. And the Scottish Government, in its proposals, did not do that. It initially proposed, Humza Yousaf, the current First Minister, proposed a specific carve-out for the expression of gender-critical speech in this context, and then pulled that proposal in the aftermath of significant backlash that he received. And so what happened was that the bill went ahead and became an act with generic freedom of expression protections, which likely, if something got into a courtroom, would be sufficient to ensure that the expression of gender-critical views or other views in this area would be protected. The problem is that virtually nobody seems to have understood that until very recently, and that includes Scottish Government ministers, Police Scotland. It seems like the messaging on this has failed to adequately take into account freedom of expression until very recently.
Well, a lot of people are saying, even if these cases made it to court, the threshold is so high that it's certainly unlikely that anyone would be prosecuted for offensive things that they've said. So what is the concern here?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, if you hit a courtroom on this, there's a bunch of provisions on the face of the bill that would make it very clear that the conduct in question would not constitute a criminal offence, and that would include respect for people's human rights. That's pretty clear. The problem that we have here is that that's not clear on the face of the Act, when it has been made clear on the face of other legislation that deals with offences of stirring up hatred. So there was an opportunity to introduce that, and it wasn't taken. But in addition to that, there's a background context here that we really should have been aware of, or that the Scottish Parliament should have been aware of when it chose to legislate into this area. And so it should have been aware that there's this background context where people are attempting to weaponise the police against their political opponents. There's a background context of the police recording non-crime hate instances, which are not criminal offences, but could lead to individuals having their lives destroyed by a report like this and getting back to their employer, for example. So there's a context there that just wasn't taken into account when this legislation was brought in, even though the legislators, including the First Minister, were acutely aware of this when they were going through the process of legislating. It just didn't end up on the face of the Act.
Well, Humza Yousaf has said that it's important that the police record non-crime hate incidents so that we can get a sense in the country of trends, that we can get a sense when there is an increase of hostility towards any minority group. What's wrong with that?
Well, you'd imagine that there wouldn't be much wrong with that if we were certain that the recording here was going to be accurate and that there was some kind of mechanism for ensuring that complaints are in some way reflecting an underlying rise in hatred. But all of these complaints will be recorded as hate instances purely by dint of the fact that someone has complained that something has happened. And you can imagine in some contexts like domestic violence, you might be willing to take a complaint at face value. But in this context, where again we know the background context is that there's a significant debate going on about the interaction between, for example, women's rights and trans rights. And, one person's legitimate expression of political speech is protected under both human rights and equality law is another person's abusive, offensive hate crime.
Well, I know that a lot of this, Michael, surrounds this idea of that conflict between women's rights and trans rights. And a lot of feminists I know are concerned that sex wasn't included in the list of protected characteristics in the hate speech bill. But I put that to Barrister Sam Fowles earlier, and he made the point that actually they're creating a whole new category for misogyny to protect women, that actually it's so important that they felt they had to keep that separate. Is that a fair point?
I think that's a fair point. It certainly, when the proposal was introduced into the Scottish Parliament, a lot of feminist groups responded and complained that this should be separated out as its own separate provision. And it seems like that's certainly what the Scottish Government has said that it intends to do. Now, whether we will see something come as a result of that is a separate point. One thing that's not on the face of the bill, though, that I think might otherwise have, it would have been better if it was that there's an offensive stirring of hatred on the basis of religion in this act, but not on the basis of philosophical belief. So that could have expanded to include the expression of protected gender-critical beliefs, such that rather than whether or not this is misogynistic hatred, if someone was to say to punch Turks in the face or to decapitate them or something like that, that could raise to the level of meeting a criminal threshold of stirring of hatred if philosophical belief was a protected characteristic under the Act, but it's not. And so one of the areas where we might have wanted to see better attention to this background context could have been in this area where the Scottish Parliament could have chosen to include philosophical belief in addition to religion in these areas.
And finally, Michael, very quickly, do you think, given the fact that there have been so many complaints about this, given the fact that a lot of vexatious complaints are coming in and it's clearly becoming unworkable, will the Scottish Police and the Scottish Government reconsider this law?
I don't know if they'll reconsider the law. I think that's obviously up for them to decide. I think they will certainly reconsider their messaging on in relation to this law. Up until very recently, both the Scottish Government and the Scottish Police Force failed to adequately provide serious messaging on freedom of expression aspects of this bill. We had a Scottish Government minister went on the radio last week and said that she wasn't sure whether misgendering was going to be a crime. That might be up for the police to decide. Now, if you're responsible for this law, you should know whether this law is going to criminalise misgendering in the abstract, which it doesn't. I mean, anybody who knows anything about this law will know that that is not true. But saying that creates the impression for an awful lot of people that it might be a criminal offence to misgender. So the messaging here, I think, clearly had to change to reflect the actual law, and I think that will happen going forward.
Michael Foran, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it.